In the name of the one and only, we are beginning another session of the Indigo Firmament. In this session, we are departing from the discussions we have had before. Several of those were titled The Perception of Islam Through the Course of History. We are moving to a new topic, and this may or may not take more than one session, but we'll try to do the best we can in explaining the terminologies that are meant to be a bit too academic, since this was one of my, they are based on one of my articles that was meant to be for a periodical, but we'll try to level with the average viewer of the program by trying to explain it and, if necessary, over-explain some of the concepts, the jargon, and the terminologies that are usually the domain of an academic setting. The title of the article on which this session of the Indigo Firmament is based is Islamist Governance at the Intersection of Democracy and Militarism. The term Islamist is different than Islamic in the sense that it's the ideology that is rooted in Islamic thought and applied in a political setting. Islamist is also a prefix or a suffix used to identify political movements of political resistance as well as political violence that are variously termed by the powers that be. But we are going to stay neutral from the political side of it. Therefore, when we say Islamist, we are trying to explain it in the context of an academic discussion. The term governance versus government. Governance is a term that's much more general in application, that encompasses government as far as government administration is concerned, government as the structure, the political structure of a state, and governance in terms of the underpinnings, ideological, political, or otherwise, or cultural. And by that, of course, we mean the political culture that that makes a political system run. The second half of the title, At the Intersection of Democracy and Militarism. Here, democracy is at one level described a form of government that reflects the desires of the people that it governs. In other words, a linkage, a connection between the governed and the governor. In other words, the administration that legitimizes its power upon the people from whom it draws its legitimacy. Militarism can be defined as the tendency of those in power who prefer to use military tactics instead of diplomacy in the resolution of political conflicts. And so therefore militarism at one level is a tendency, an inclination towards the application of military power for the solution or resolution of political conflict. And in more recent times, it has, I think, an additional meaning, which is one of the inclusion or the involvement of corporate power, especially those who are involved in and invested in the production of heavy military weapons. So corporations that produce, companies that produce military weapons, regardless of whether we classify them as weapons of mass destruction or not, they do result in mass destruction. So those corporations and their role with the government, where they then connect with the militarism. In other words, in strictly economic terms, you cannot produce a commodity for which there's no demand. You can only produce that which can be sold and bought and used by people. Those could be the necessities of life, the many inventions that our technology permits us to do so. However, in the case of militarism, that which the heavy weapon and the military weapon production corporations produce have no other use other than their use in political conflicts. And this brings about a contradiction, a cross purpose, and between those who rule us in the name of people and then involve us in military conflicts because they are vested in the production of weapons. Let me rephrase that in a different way. That arms producers produce arms with the intent to use them. They themselves are not involved in that, so they will have to be used, as I said, in conflicts, in political conflicts where resolutions go awry and a political conflict, instead of being solved and resolved through diplomatic means, is then pushed aside and replaced with a military solution. And it's in the military solution that weapons are used. And it's in the use of weapons that which is produced by the arms manufacturers in a way finds a consumer. And the consumers are the governments that engage in wars. And so therefore there is a conflict of interest. Governments that engage in warfare and claim to be serving the people are in essence not serving the people but serving corporations, because it does not help people if they become the gun fodder. It does not help people if it's they who pay with their lives. It does not help people to invest in wars of destruction instead of projects of construction. It doesn't help people when you take the majority of the human resource of a society that could be effectively used in agriculture, in economic development, in economic infrastructure, to improve the lives of people. And instead of those energies that would be used in such peaceful endeavors, they are redirected in the name of nationalism, in the name of quote-unquote national interests, and therefore they are redirected towards warfare. And so militarism in essence is the direct opposite of democracy, because if democracy is the government of the people and the people's primary interests, economic, health, social welfare, agriculture, and other developmental projects that improve the lives of the people, are in a way held hostage by militarists who rather engage in the destruction rather than in the construction. Therefore, many governments that claim democracy can in principle be not considered democratic if their primary concern is military engagement, because militarism doesn't serve the people. They may serve certain objectives of certain governments. They certainly serve the aims of arms manufacturers. They certainly serve the aims of big corporations who benefit from these as war profiteers, but they do not serve the interests of the people. So therefore, militarism is the direct opposite of democracy. Now, I don't think there is any government in the world who correctly describes or names itself as a military government, or as a militarist government, to put it more correctly. However, almost every government in the world somehow brags about being democratic, and that is the greatest deception even now in the 21st century. And if we go back to the 1960s and 70s, at the height of communism, for instance, every communist government that had a counterpart in the non-communist world distinguished themselves by naming themselves democratic. For instance, South Korea was the Republic of Korea. North Korea was the Democratic Republic of Korea. West Germany was the Federal Republic of Germany. East Germany was the Democratic Republic of Germany. And almost every other communist government called itself democratic, because in principle, socialism or communism was supposed to be serving the people. However, in reality, those were the governments that denied people more civil liberties than any other. And civil liberties are directly connected with the people. So therefore, they could not be democratic if the demos, or the people's primary interests and human rights and civil liberties and civil rights are curtailed more by these governments. So therefore, the term democratic became a fashionable honorific, a fashionable title, a fashionable naming of a government, as if that really made them democratic. Far from it. This leaves the non-communist world, where there too governments very loosely and liberally applied the term democracy, democratic system, or the free world, that were not necessarily free. And they were not free in exactly in the context in which we are discussing them. That militarism was prevalent on both camps, communist or state capitalist, as well as capitalist state or free enterprise states. Militarism had taken over. We saw in the course of that whole century, the 20th century, numerous wars, and these were not skirmishes and battles, but all-out wars that devastated most of the world, and especially Europe, twice over during the wars that were called World War I and World War II, that were in essence European War I and European War II. And so these same countries that twice resorted to the most devastating warfare in the world, that resulted in the killing of not hundreds and thousands, but hundreds, millions of people on all sides. And why were these people killed? Often the charge that is made that it's someone's belief system, or religious wars or crusades and all that, that religion is the primary reason, or God, or a belief and conviction, a certain belief and conviction in God is the primary cause of wars. It's not so, certainly not in the 21st century, in the 20th century, because those wars were not fought in the name of religion or the name of a certain God, but rather for militarism. We saw Germany, after its impressive economic and industrial development as it became a nation state in the 19th century. And that industrial growth was primarily engaged towards military industries before World War I or European War I. And it was also re-engaged in that militarism after the First War. We saw Russia, that then became the Soviet Union, presumably a Tsarist Russia with a human face. But Tsarist Russia, that was, if not literally a third world country, it was a considerably backward country compared to other European states. And the only reason that it rose to a status of becoming a superpower eventually towards the end, or at least the second half of the 20th century, was due to its industrialization. But the industrialization of Russia, or Soviet Russia, was not an industrialization that primarily helped the people. Rather, it was a industrialization for militarization. Russia had more tanks than probably any country on the face of Earth. The same goes for all other military use technologies and products, whether it was the warplanes or any other of the products that made Russia so prominent, so industrialized, so advanced. All this advancement was for military use, and its use not only within the Soviet Union, but within its satellite states in Eastern Europe, and within the third world countries where Russian military arms and weapons could be bought for a lower price compared to those produced in the West. The Russian Jeep or the Kalashnikov machine gun, for instance, became the trademark of most third world military conflicts. The accessibility, the availability, their use, that devastated these societies because, in essence, regardless of what cause it was fought for, and what cause it was used in, ultimately, the faster, the more mechanized these killing machines became, obviously the more they killed. So the great amount of the devastation and the loss of the human life was due to these quote-unquote industrializations, which were meant to support militarization. Just to give you an example, in Soviet Russia, for example, Russian jeeps were all over the place. Cars that were built on the chassis of Russian jeeps, such as Volga and others, including Chaika and so on, these had the appearance of a civilian use, but that was in essence a side effect of the military production. You could have these cars and jeeps and all that in a much shorter time than you could have things, for instance, as a refrigerator. In Soviet Russia, depending on what part of it and which republic you lived in, you had to wait from 5 to 10 years to get a refrigerator. Why? Because the refrigerator was not primarily of a military use kind of product. It was strictly a civilian use, so therefore it did not get a priority in production, in mass production. And you could say the same about almost every other thing, whether it was camera or TVs and so on and so forth, that yes, they were produced, but they were considerably of a lower quality. Russian cameras, Russian TVs, Russian refrigerators were of a considerably lower quality compared to what was produced in the West. But then Russian jet fighters and Russian jeeps and Russian tanks and Russian armored vehicles were then much more comparable to that which was produced in the West. So it was this militarism that rose, that helped the Soviet Union rise to the level of a superpower. And so often, again, when things are not analyzed correctly, the credit is given to communism as a system or to socialism as a political system. But if socialism has its primary task of serving the people, most of that which made the Soviet Union as a superpower were not meant to be for that. Therefore, that is an incorrect and inaccurate description of how the Soviet Union became a superpower. Now, things are not much different over in the West. Here, too, military expenditures. Just in the last 10-15 years, the United States, the dominant superpower, perhaps the only superpower of its time, I don't know for how long it's going to remain as the only superpower in a unipolar world arrangement, but at least for now, in the last 15 years, more than $4 trillion have been spent in the various wars that the United States has engaged in. And the number of killed, of course, not here, but abroad. Yes, we lost somewhere around 2,600 people in the bombing of the World Trade Center, in the attack on the World Trade Center. That is usually rounded to 3,000. But that 3,000 casualty is nowhere near to the 1.3 million people that have been killed, primarily in the countries, in the war zones, in which we are engaged, in which the United States is engaged, from Syria to Afghanistan, from Iraq to Yemen, from Somalia to Libya, all over the Middle East, that now there is no deterrence from any other superpower that would challenge the United States in its military ventures. It is engaging in there much more freely, much more frequently, and with much more devastation. So therefore, when we look at the concept of militarism, it has not left us. But within a week, we are going to have an election in the United States. And nobody would be thinking that we are electing a commander-in-chief. We often say we are electing a president. And a president is a representative of the people. But that is not what we are doing for several reasons. Number one, American presidents are not elected by means of a popular vote or a popular election. They are elected by the Electoral College, which is supposed to be representing the people. But that's a whole other story that raises questions of the possibilities of constitutional reform that, in my opinion, unless there is a constitutional reform in the United States, our democracy is going to remain more and more in name rather than in substance. But the point I was trying to make was that we have the perception that we are electing a president of the United States, that we are electing a government. But the person who is elected as the president becomes much more significant as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States of America. And it's in that function that militarism is thriving. That it doesn't matter who gets to the White House. The agenda of American militarism is inscribed in stone, and it is set in motion. And the interesting thing was that when President Obama was elected, within a few months, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in the hopes that he would live up to the expectations that people in the world have of the President of the United States, of being truly a president for peace. Instead, we saw that in the aggressive military operations the United States had already engaged during the presidency of George W. Bush, that there was no change in the positive, rather there was more in the negative. In other words, the Obama administration got engaged in those wars much more aggressively than before. And what becomes the greatest deception for the American public is that we perceive that our Republican administrations, our Republican presidents are warmongers. They are more aggressive. They are more conservative. They are less considerate of the world community as a whole, but they are more engaged in what they perceive to have or make the United States as the number one country. In other words, in their priorities, Americans are number one. Perhaps that's why Trump wants to make America great, and by great it's implied that he wants to make it number one. Now, there's nothing wrong with being number one, but whether you become number one as a state on your own merits is different from becoming number one at the expense of others. And what is happening in these wars is that we become number one at the expense of other states. Our presidents have to engage in wars to appear patriotic. People in other countries have to die so that our presidents would have the credibility of being true American, so we can vote for them again. You can go back to as far as you want to, but let's start with the Reagan administration. His tough line of argument with Gorbachev, his toughness in engaging the Arab world, and the event that led to the barrack bombing in Beirut, and then the United States sending the USS New Jersey to bomb the hell out of that beautiful city that was eventually devastated. Then we subsequently had the attack on Grenada, the attack on Panama, and President Clinton's attack on Iraq, and the imposition of the embargoes. It can go on and on. In other words, most of these aggressions against foreign governments, legitimate or not, happens during election years, because our presidents have to prove to their own people, to the American people, that to them America is number one, and basically saying the hell with the rest of the world. We have to show and demonstrate our patriotism by engaging other poor countries who are no match for our military prowess. They are no match. But we have to show our patriotism, our supranationalism, our devotion to America as number one, by attacking this, that, or the other country. This doesn't make us democratic, because democracy need not be confined within the boundaries of one or another state. Demo means people, and people is not defined within national boundaries. People are people. We cannot become democratic at home if we are not democratic abroad. If we venture into militarism in other lands, in other countries, where people on their side mostly, but in a few cases on our side, die, that's not democracy. That's corporatocracy. When you serve the corporations rather than the people, the term democracy becomes irrelevant unless it's seen as a slogan. That's why I think in the field of peace advocacy around the world, peace advocacy had to be our new religion of the 21st century. Peace has its universality. Peace has, as a desire, as a dream, as a yearning for all of us. There isn't a living being anywhere on the face of earth that does not want peace. Yes, some engage in political violence. And these political violences are either sponsored by states or sponsored by individual groups. We have to condemn both. One's action produces the other's reaction. Violence is violence. The argument that is often made is that if we claim to be a civilized world, if we laugh at how our ancestors lived with their primitive mindsets, with their parochial concerns, with their narrow-mindedness, have we really departed from that? Are we really different from that? And how is it that we are different? If we are killing more than they ever did, if we are killing more, quote-unquote, effectively, because our war machines are more effective, how are we more civilized? If we can engage in each other in the many languages that we can speak, how can we blame them for not engaging in diplomacy when the language barriers were deeper or higher, depending on how you look at them? Therefore, our civility at the global level, our adherence to civil rights and civil liberties at the global level had to be questioned. And they had to be questioned not because there is not enough yearning and desire for peace, but because of those who disrupt such situations, and because of those who engage in militarism. And that is the main problem, militarism. We could probably set a new standard that any country that is engaged in a military conflict at home or abroad or both, any country that is involved in the production of military armware and in the export and trade of it around the world, and any country that stands in the way of efforts such as those for the demining of the former battlefields, where thousands die every year because of the unexploded mines, that any country that is involved in such activities, in such militarism, should not qualify as democratic, because they are, in a way, directly, indirectly, through proxies, through the sale of weapons, through creating conflicts, through supporting belligerent parties. They are engaged in the killing of human beings, regardless of what the color of their skin or what their name and what their geographic or national identities are. Democracy is a beautiful term, but not too many of us live up to its value. If democracy was meant to take power from the governing authorities and distribute it to those who are ruled by such laws, if democracy was meant to create a level playing field, if democracy was meant to get rid of subjects of the kings and create citizens of a republic, we have to live up to that name. We have to live up to those expectations. That will make us democratic. Not a slogan, not a label, not an official name. And therefore, so long as the world is engaged in militarism, by definition, we cannot claim them to be democratic. Yes, those who have more power define others in less desired names, so to say. But the main problem still remains the same, that we have to create a new equation. And in this equation, the enemy of democracy is no longer communism. And yes, the enemy of democracy is not necessarily religious extremism, no matter what the religion affiliation is. The enemy of democracy is militarism. Because it's because of militarism that many of these governments engage in political violence. Take the case of Syria, for example. Syria has beautiful cities such as Aleppo and Damascus that are known to be the longest inhabited cities in human history. Aleppo and Damascus are the longest continuously inhabited cities in human history. And yet, we are destroying them as fast as we can. So for most of their history, that goes back to several thousand years, perhaps 3 or 4 or more years, that these cities have been continuously inhabited. That distinction does not belong to many cities around the world. Damascus and Aleppo deserve that. Continuously inhabited cities. Those are the cities we are destroying. Who is we? Almost every government that claims some sort of a democracy as their political identity, as their label of distinction, as their claim to legitimacy, these are the governments that are engaged in the destruction of those cities. Yes, the cities, their souks and bazaars, their hallways and homes, their places of worships, the churches and mosques, all of those. But more importantly, the defenseless people in those cities that are bombed by their own government of Bashar Assad, the government of Iran, and the government of Russia and China. They are bombing certain parts. And then we have the governments of the United States, France, Germany, and some other European states, along with Turkey, that are bombing the other half. And then when the opposing belligerent parties move to a different part of the city, they keep going at it. They have leveled these cities worse than Dresden, worse than perhaps Grozny. If those were cities we ought to have been ashamed of in terms of how horribly we destroyed humans and human life. we are repeating the same thing at the start of the 21st century. And what for? Because the claim is made that a particular government, for instance, Bashar Assad's government, is not democratic. So, if that government is not democratic, and if democratic means the government of the people, and if by the people we mean the people of Syria, what say do the people of Syria have in these military operations? In order for it to be democratic, it should be the people of Syria that decide and determine what kind of government they ought to have. And the reason all these many governments are engaged in these military operations, in these bombing sorties, is because they want a government to their liking, not necessarily to the liking of the people of Syria. The Russians want one kind of government, the kind of government that Putin wants. The Americans or the French and the German want a different kind of government that would be to the liking of the Americans and the French and the Germans, for example. Does that make it democratic? What right do we have to choose a government for another people, which is the choosing of our governments that do not reflect the interests of neither, say, the American people nor of the Syrian people? The kind of government that is desired is not desired by the people of Russia nor by the people of Syria. And the government in Syria, who should have, in the first place, given its people those civil liberties, if it wanted to claim to be democratic. Hafiz Assad, the president's father, was a military officer who did his training in Egypt, was involved in the unification of Syria with Egypt in the United Arab Republic. He was a maverick, a progressive, but only of his time, 1950s and 60s. Perhaps he was not as worldly as one would have thought, but Bashar Assad is worldly. He has studied abroad in England. He's a doctor. I think his wife, too, is well educated. And these people ought to have a much broader worldview to understand what democracy is. And so when the Arab Spring swept the many lands across North Africa and Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East, the Syrians approached the issue in the most sensible way of launching protests demanding for more civil liberties, or perhaps more correctly, asking for civil rights and civil liberties. That could have been granted. That would have saved Syria from the turmoil it is in now, and it would have saved Syria from the typhoon and the tsunami of the Arab Spring. But that wasn't to be. So, for the people of Syria, it was bad enough that their own president denied them their civil rights, to be more suppressive than he ever was before. For a quote-unquote Western educated man to act in medieval modalities of suppressing its own people, that was bad enough. That was worse than anyone could imagine. But it was even worse when other regional and global powers got engaged in this. But ultimately, no matter how we describe this, in the final analysis, it's the people of Syria who are denied their rights. And whoever engages in these wars, whether it's through aerial bombardment, whether it's through embargoes, economic embargoes, whether it's through campaigns to isolate, they cannot be democratic so long as the ultimate victim of their action is a people, the people of Syria. And in that sense, we can see that then the current situation in Syria is the worst that militarism, international militarism, has come to. It's in its worst form in terms of its devastation. But even more so, it's worse because it's an entanglement from which it is almost impossible to disengage. And because the belligerent parties that are actively engaged in this military conflict cannot sort things out to everyone's liking. The more variables, the more factors that are in that conflict, the more difficult it becomes to resolve it. And militarism is having a wonderful time because the consumption of large amounts of weapons by all parties concerned results in the more production of military weapons in the various factories across the world. And what's interesting is that the city of Aleppo, Halab, used to be famous for making the best swords in the world. The way they forged the steel and they made their swords, that was their trademark, the trademark of Aleppo. And centuries later, Aleppo has become the graveyard for tons and tons of steel that is dropped from all corners of the world on this misfortunate city. That steel could be the planes, the bombs, the helicopters, the machine guns, the hand grenades, and in every other conceivable form. Aleppo, that was known for its own steel, is now buried under other forms of steel that comes from all around the world, and it's raining upon its people. That is the true face of militarism. It is the true face of militarism because it has more visibility. It is the true face of militarism because the opposing parties, Russian versus Americans, Turks versus Iranians, Germans versus French, and so on and so forth, because they want to reveal the atrocities of the other, so the world community has a little more exposure to it. But many of the other conflicts where the lines are clearly defined between the belligerent parties, such atrocities are not revealed with such openness. And in many cases, they're pushed under the rug, so to say. They are covered. We saw many such atrocities committed by American troops in Afghanistan. The use of depleted uranium that has resulted in miscarriages and deformed births in parts of Afghanistan. The outburst of American military men, such as in Panjwai district of Kandahar, and there were many more, and that which happens in the camps, in the torture camps. Who pays the price? And how much do we know about them? The very fact that the United States was a signatory to the United Nations Charter and to many of the Geneva Conventions, because we went around and told the world, by we, I mean we Americans. Remember how President Woodrow Wilson was marginalized in the Versailles Conference because his peace plan was not accepted, his 14-point plan for peace in the world, and his demand for the formation of the League of Nations was of all parties rejected by the United States Congress. Militarism. And then after the Second War, we became signatories to the formation of the United Nations, to the Charter of the United Nations that was signed in San Francisco. We were the signatories to the Geneva Conventions and to almost every other effort around the world to make this world more peaceful, so that we human citizens of the world could at least claim some degree of civility. We were the vanguards. We Americans were loved around the world for not only advocating peace, but by teaching peace, by preaching peace, by sending our Peace Corps volunteers to make the lives of people better in the Third World, by launching the Marshall Plan and other plans to make the lives of the Europeans better. That's what America stood for. Where we are now is a far cry from that truth. It's now when we, the signatories of the Geneva Convention, are denying prisoners of war their right, because we can simply redefine them as enemy combatants. That's a shame. This is what America came to. That is what America was when America was loved, because we truly became not only a beacon of democracy, but we aspired people around the world. We showed the people around the world how we can all live better together. And now that emphasis on the concept of living better together is being threatened by our American exceptionalism and our cultural relativism. Now, when we call for making America great, it is often meant to be at the expense of others. So we are now recreating a distance between ourselves and the others. And then when there is a protest somewhere around the world, an anti-American protest, we are surprised. We should not be surprised. We have to live up to the dreams and expectations of those Americans who came after the European war in the 40s and 50s, who built America and made it number one, not at the expense of others. But we made America number one because we broke and destroyed barriers between our own people. Gender barriers, racial barriers, ethnic barriers, religious barriers, all came down. And one America, one strong America, an America of diversity, was the America that we built. And now there are calls for a regression to the past century. We need to look forward. Let's hope that we all do that in the fraternity of our common humanity. We can embrace each other, to love each other and to care for each other, and to get rid of the otherness in the other, so we can remain just we and no more. We, the common human family. And I leave you with that thought, wishing you a happy day.